We're going to start, as tradition would have it, by creating a plane with one subdivision and centering it in the middle of our scene. Now this plane is, imagine this plane is our texture space here, and we're just going to be working right on it. So that's more or less the trail. I'm going to be making the trail you just saw. I'm going to be venturing from it a little bit, but largely that's my reference. Remember, as always, don't forget to use reference, because if you don't, whatever you're making is probably going to look like crap, and if it doesn't, then it's because you got lucky. So the plan here is to make a little library of rocks from which to pull to start to fill that whole plane with rocks. Now we're not going to do the dirt. That would be insane to do dirt in 3D, right? So we're going to leave that to photos and Crazy Bump, but all the rocks on top I'd like to be modeled out so they can have clean normal maps and whatnot. So once we have a sufficient library of rocks, we're going to start making little clusters of rocks and start copying those clusters around. We're not going to go through placing each rock one by one because there's going to be a ton of them, and that would take a long time. Now these rocks are eventually going to be pretty small. Right now they look pretty big, but that's simply because this is just a library to draw from. They're going to be so small that they really don't have to look very good. They don't have to stand up to macro photography or anything like that. So you can see I'm just duping and duping rocks I've already done and slightly modifying them to get some different ones. And some of them look better than others. And making sure to continually look at reference. I rely on reference even for something so tiny as rocks. I don't like to guess. So I am adding just a little bevel on them to ensure that light is beating up at the corners and that these rocks are going to show up well as a normal map. Excellent. So I think that's my library. I'm just making them all gray, just a normal map material. And I'm going to start making my first little cluster here. So they're not going to be this big. I'm just making the first cluster, and I'll continue to scale them down until they're the right size here. And it doesn't matter if they're all at the same height. They can all be at different heights and whatnot, because the normal map is not going to take that into account. So even if you have some rock just on its side that it would never, like that rock for instance, just kind of sticking up on its side like that, like it would never sit like that on the ground. It doesn't really matter, because once it all gets baked down to the normal map, it's not going to matter. So I use this collapse utility a lot, which by default is not in your utilities panel, and I just wanted to show you guys real fast how to add it. I thought it was in more, but it's actually not in more. That's not how you add it. You click on that little icon there to the right of sets that I just clicked on, and it's just right there on the left, and you can set your total buttons and just drag and drop it onto a blank button. So you just make a selection and press collapse, and then press collapse selected, and it'll just turn it all into one editable mesh. And then I usually immediately convert it to an editable poly, and usually your X form is really messed up, so you add the reset X form modifier and then convert it to an editable poly again, which sounds like it's a lot of steps, but I've gotten to a point where I do it in about 0.01 seconds because it's like in muscle memory. So here I go with my second cluster. I just duped my first one, and I'm going to modify it. I set everything to its individual origin and rotated stuff around a little bit, just so each rock is orientated a little bit different. And now I'm kind of just taking little sections of rocks and moving them about. And I'm using that collapse button again. I'm going to be using it pretty much for every cluster. The reason why I'm not duping my my clusters as editable polys is because I want to make sure that each rock has an individual origin, because that's a good way of making it a different variant, just rotating them on individual origins and then moving some parts of the cluster around. Here, I'm going to do it again. So I just dupe it and rotate stuff on its individual origin, then maybe rotate the whole thing a little bit and delete certain rocks and move the clusters within the cluster around to get a different cluster at large. And I accidentally added my plane, as you can see by the white bounding box. And now is a good time as ever to name my plane something decent, such as Baker plane. So I've had mostly like these concentrated clusters. What a weird stutter that was. So now I've done like a more sparse one, and that's gonna fill out larger areas more sparsely, I guess. And it's important for your different clusters to have different characteristics like that. It would look very unnatural to have a bunch of neat contained little clusters, so you need to make sure to have some really weird ones as well. And you see that I've just run the rocks off the edge of the plane, but I'm only doing that for one side of the plane, because what I'm going to do at the end to make this thing tile is I'm simply going to marquee select those little excess rocks that are kind of just running off the plane, and I'm just going to drag them to the other side of the plane to make it tile. Now, if that makes no sense at all, I understand. It's a hard thing to explain, but you'll certainly understand when you see it. Now I'm making a cluster that is just super sparse, just cover a huge area, collapsing it, resetting my X form, centering my pivot. And again, it doesn't matter if all your rocks are sitting perfectly on the ground plane, because the normal map won't notice a difference. So the time has come to make the other little buildup of rocks in the trail. So I've just made kind of a random selection of the one I already did and just duped it and rotated it. I'm doing it again now, but I'm pretty much the same thing. So I'm doing that trick again where I rotate on individual object pivots to really get a lot of variation. So by the end of it, it's going to look like you certainly won't notice any repeating patterns. Really starting to like the way that looks. Just turning off wireframe and looking at it just with the gray. And continuing to add a few more supplementary rocks, but I think we're about ready now to bake this guy down. The only thing left to do would be to make this texture tile, and I'm going to do that in a moment. And I am saving for the very first time, which is very bad. You guys should save your stuff earlier than this. And as usual, I'm creating the final directory I want this thing in the build of the game. I never make those dumb intermediate files. People sometimes make everything just on their desktop while they're working and then move it. I think that's a dumb idea, because you're gonna have to move it in the end anyway. And I accidentally called it dirt, but I meant to call it dirt trail. So since I'm OCD, I'm going back and deleting that dirt.max file. And I'm previewing how this thing is going to tile by selecting everything and just duping it a couple times. And I like the way it looks. Just cleaning up my scene. I selected everything and scaled it in a little bit just so it's a little bit further away from the edge there. And I'm going to leave all of the working files intact. You saw me dupe one off and put it off to the side, because now I'm combining it all into an editable poly, but I want to make sure that I have all those original clusters in case I need to make any changes. And here we go with making it tile. I'm just selecting with a marquee those excess rocks that come off the edge. and I'm just shift dragging them over to the right edge, being sure to make it a new object so that I can easily grab it again. And I'm looking real close. I'm looking at one rock and exactly where it crosses over the line, and I'm using that as a reference point for the other side to make certain that this texture is going to flow seamlessly into itself. Okay, and now I'm going to bake this puppy down. So I just press 0 to bring up your render to texture dialog. Mine has a little error message because my max is kind of messed up. And just picking my high poly, which I named Pebbles HP. Okay, being sure my little projection cage is covering my whole model. And adding a normals map and increasing my resolution to 2048. That's not going to be my final res, but I always like to render high and then downsample later. Choosing where I want to put it. And I want to have a little ambient occlusion to go with my normals. I don't know if I'm going to use it, but I always just like to have it, so I'm quickly just adding a skylight. And since the render buffer automatically shows you your complete render, lighting and diffuse, that render buffer output, I'll just save it off and that will serve as my ambient occlusion pass. And before you render, be sure to enable light tracer in the render settings, otherwise the skylight doesn't work. But I'll spare you guys the actual rendering. So in the next chapter, we'll have our baked normals and ambient occlusion in Photoshop, and we'll add color, texture, actual dirt under these rocks, among other things, and do everything we need to do to turn this into an actual texture. Then I'll be bringing it into CryEngine and using Crytek's Sweet Road system to view it, but of course you can bring yours into whatever engine you like, and we'll see how sweet it looks.